Are you a racist? Do you hate Mexicans? The media calls us racist for wanting to build Trump's wall. They censor us, but it doesn't change the truth. Joe Biden's open border is killing Ohioans, with more illegal drugs and more Democrat voters pouring into this country. This issue is personal. I nearly lost my mother to the poison coming across our border. No child should grow up an orphan. I'm JD Vance, and I approve this message because whatever they call us, we will put America first.
Yeah. Oye, es nada más y nada menos que el motherfucker habla sin mente. De Plaza de Kings. Estos bebés son Big Papo, dude. No sean rebeldes, deja el revolú. Yo no me quede, yo me hospede junto a Belzebú. No me remete, plebe, no soy leve como tú. Si hay algo que no muere, eso es el hip hop Perú. Y pa' estos pericotes traje una chica perica. Atrás te voy a mostrar como dos monstruos rap trafican. No trate ni trepe, solo trote, señorita. Treque, donde la sangre salpica. Se aplica, te explica, replica. ¿Pa' qué? Aplica, practica, suplica. Con fe a mi perro grita, yo lo mataré. Tu madre llora y canta la bandeja, flow peregrina, chivolo propina, ina, hacen base, mejor coja vaselina, no imagina, mi vida fuera de una esquina, yo solo quiero más chavos pa' comprar más chilindrina, gira, que somos puros animales rompiendo de todos los cristales, repete señales que a ti no te sale, ¿qué pasa compadre? Somos naturales, voy a llenar todas las editoriales, rate de mi huevo pa' los tribunales, tú eres un antianal, yo experto en artesanales, yeah, se me afaga la cimaita, sopló.
Hey, Terco 92 B09 está en la casa, barrio. Escucha ahí. Así se hace, Yo. Tengo problemas de actitud y poca paciencia. Hablo si me da la gana, nadie me silencia. No quieren aceptar que pa' muchos soy la voz de los barrios que llega a tocar tu conciencia. Yo sé que muchos quieren llegar a ser tendencia y hacen lo que sea, saben las consecuencias. Es la diferencia, yo mantengo mi esencia y ustedes por pegar han cambiado hasta de apariencia. Y no es que lo diga yo, pero la gran evidencia es que cambian de personalidad con frecuencia. Y no son locos con inteligencia, solo quieren un poco de atención con insistencia. No presumo en nada, hago todo a mi conveniencia. Por eso te doy una sugerencia. Conmigo no busquen competencia, que llevo 10 años ganándole a la vida y lo sabe la audiencia. La firme que ocurrencia, ¿cómo pueden joder sin prudencia? No se dan cuenta que mi experiencia es a base de exigencia. Mi trabajo es con independencia y el de otros de un productor depende de su permanencia. Soy firme en la resistencia, dándole más rap en el track hasta por correspondencia. Que muchos discos evolucionaron, no es coincidencia. El dinero y la fama hizo que pierdan su decencia. Terco 92, cuando quieras, donde quieras.
¿Cómo? Sí. He aprendido a sobrevivir de las maldades, comprendiendo que nada es como tú sabes. Pa' decir verdad, la lucho a diario. No me critiques, no me justifico, siempre hago lo que predico. Soy de barrio y rico en talento. De una me sacan por mi forma de ser y me acento en el yauca. Mi gente la está rompiendo por ser parte de este movimiento. Quiero saludar a las personas que nunca confiaron en mí, que hoy por hoy se paltean cuando me ven venir. Bye bye motherfuckers, en estas líneas voy a fluir. Déjate llevar como hay people in the street. Yo, déjate llevar como hay people in the street. Hey, 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 oh, yeah, hey. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 es la torita aquí en la casa, primo.
Isaiah chapter 58 and verse 1. Cry aloud, spare not, lift up thy voice like a trumpet, and show my people their transgressions, and the house of Jacob their sins.
Copyright disclaimer. This content does not belong to Bible Chronicles or claim this intellectual property. The content provided today has and always will belong to the content owner. Bible Chronicles does not have any affiliation with the owner of this property. As mentioned, Bible Chronicles did not intend to make use of any material for the purpose of harvesting gain. However, Title 17 of United States copyright law states material and use can only be done when it's for theological or general educational purposes, and thus Bible Chronicles believes that this principal material falls under fair use, which honors protection under Section 107 of the same U.S. copyright law.
So I always tell people that I think that racism against Mexicans is kind of dormant. You just need somebody to fan the flames a little bit, and then people believe it all over again.
Turmoil, prejudice, racism, and resistance. These barriers have always described the Mexican experience passing through the American border, but never more so than during the Mexican Revolution in the early 20th century. Between 1910 and 1930, the amount of Mexicans immigrating into the United States tripled. This surge of refugees triggered anti-immigrant sentiment and concerns that the war would spread over the border to affect Americans. The tension was felt in no place more than El Paso, a border city right across the Rio Grande from the Mexican city of Juarez. Each day, thousands of Mexican workers crossed the border to work in the United States and experienced the rising racial discrimination firsthand. One such worker was a woman named Carmelita Torres, whose leadership in the 1917 Bath riots attempted to break social, political, and physical barriers of American hostility. Torres empowered Mexican immigrants to protest their maltreatment and inspired Mexican women to begin social political activism in the face of rampant sexism. Despite her efforts, these barriers were strengthened in the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution and World War I. Fear swept along the border in the early 20th century. The 1915 arrest of Mexican revolutionaries Victoriano Huerta and Pascual Orozco in New Mexico only helped to intensify the prejudice. Then, tensions reached a breaking point. On January 12, 1916, tragedy struck in Santa Isabel, Mexico. Border tensions reached a breaking point in the city of El Paso, Texas. In 1915, recently elected Mayor Tom Lee was obsessed with cleanliness. His vision of scrubbing the city clean of corruption, drugs, and minorities set the stage for years of social, political, and physical barriers for immigrants into the United States.
Hundreds of dirty, lousy, destitute Mexicans arriving at El Paso daily will undoubtedly bring and spread typhus unless a quarantine is placed at once.
This anti-Mexican sentiment was reflected in government policy and in jails. Crude methods of disinfection began, including the soaking of Mexican prisoners in gasoline, often resulting in tragedy.
A flash of flame burst from tanks in which prisoners, including Mexicans, were being given disinfecting baths in the campaign to prevent the spread of disease from Mexico. A match lighted by one of the bathers in disregard of orders was said to have caused the explosion.
On January 24, 1917, El Paso announced a full quarantine of Mexican immigrants from Juarez.
All persons entering El Paso from Mexico between the hours of 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. will be subject to quarantine inspection and disinfection of their person and effects when considered necessary or advisable by the quarantine officer.
This political and physical barrier went into effect a mere 3 days later, alongside a government-instituted disinfection plan. For Mexican immigrants, the effects of this political and physical barrier were immediate and harsh.
They're first going to be segregated by sex when they go into the facility. They're going to be forced to strip naked. Their clothes are going to be taken away from them, and they're going to be chemically scoured. They're going to be laundered. And what they're doing is they're checking for lice.
Some Mexicans willingly went through the baths multiple times a day, in hopes of selling border to others who were desperate to evade the humiliation at the border. Rumors even broke out that the health personnel were photographing the nude bathers and spreading their pictures throughout the town. One woman, Carmelita Torres, was enraged by these humiliating barriers to Mexican women. Carmelita was a 17-year-old Mexican maid who lived in Juarez and crossed into El Paso every day to work. She resisted. Later, the American people would come to know her as the auburn-haired Amazon due to her fiery hair and passion. At 7:30 a.m. on January 28, 1917, only one day after the quarantine was implemented, a riot broke out at the Santa Fe Bridge border crossing. At the center of the riot was Carmelita Torres, whose sparks ignited a flame that roared across the city. Over 200 women stood by her side, throwing bottles and rocks at officers, blocking traffic and any streetcars that attempted to pass. Backlash to the riots was severe. Newspapers referred to the protests as assaults, depicting the officers at the scene as heroes and calling the general scene laughable. Despite the ridiculing of the bath riots, the event empowered Mexican immigrants to protest the societal barriers built against them on both sides of the border, despite having to live through one of the worst anti-immigrant periods in the world. After the bath riots, Mexican immigrants felt empowered to band together to emerge from privacy and fight against the barriers placed against them. One prominent organization that did exactly this was the Orden Hijos de America, a San Antonio-based group that was created in 1921 and set out to influence all fields of social, economic, and political action in order to realize the greatest enjoyment possible of the rights extended by the American Constitution. The Orden successfully desegregated beaches, schools, and housing projects, as well as helping to place the first ever Mexican American on a jury in 1927. Back in Mexico, Carmelita Torres' courage was also a key moment in the rising Mexican feminist movement to break gendered social barriers. One prominent example was a law passed in Mexico the very same year as the bath riots, the Law of Family Relations. The law gave women the right to receive alimony, to own property, to take part in legal suits, and to have the same rights of men in cases of child custody. This law broke significant economic and legal barriers for Mexican women, and was passed largely due to the activism of Mexican women in Mexico City. In another instance, Hermila Galindo, a Mexican feminist activist, presented demands of suffrage in front of an all-male assembly at the 1917 Constitutional Convention. Unfortunately, these changes would not last. Women like Carmelita were suppressed and even silenced from history.
We just don't know much about her. And that, here's a person that we know about one incident that she is responsible for, and then she's been lost to history, as so many people are who are not elites, that don't come from the majority population. We just know very little about them.
Despite the efforts of activists and freedom fighters like Carmelita Torres, widespread discriminatory barriers against immigrants continue into the modern era. Under the current administration, barriers for Mexican immigrants are still very much in place at the highest level.
These ideas about Mexicans are something that have been around for more than 100 years. They're deeply ingrained in the kind of discourse in general in the United States.
They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Although there's been no significant construction on a wall, the Trump administration is creating new barriers against immigrations along the Mexican-American border. One of its most controversial moves is the mass detention of migrant families who tried to enter the country, including the separation of children from their parents. Not only are these barriers racially charged and damaging to child development, they are also illegal. In July 2017, U.S. District Judge Dolly G. found the Trump administration had breached the 1997 Flores Agreement by not providing migrant children with appropriate food or hygienic supplies, housing them in cold facilities without beds. In 1917, Mexican immigrants entering the border were forced through detention camps in inhumane conditions. A century later, the exact same thing is occurring. A grim piece of the past revived in the present.
The only way that you can institute control is by coming up with new mechanisms, whether it be delousing and baiting and all of that, to discourage them from coming over, or coming up with, discriminatory housing practices and not letting people get an education. And the only way that you can do that is through laws, right? I think the same thing is going on today.
Luckily, in 2020, activists like Carmelita Torres are no longer an anomaly. While the bath riots were an isolated incident and a long chain of unbroken barriers, injustice today is recognized and called out for what it is. Millions of Latina women are now empowered to stand up against the social and racial barriers deeply ingrained in American society against immigrants. One such woman is Zara Liviere, the founder of the People's Defense Initiative, a grassroots nonprofit in Tucson. In recent years, they have successfully lobbied for sanctuary status to be considered in Tucson and have conducted several demonstrations against SB 1070, an oppressive legal and social barrier that gives police the ability to stop and integrate any Mexican American within reasonable suspicion. The PDI also protests for LGBTQ and women's rights, making it the perfect intersection of feminism and immigrant activism for which Carmelita Torres stood. Carmelita Torres helped crack barriers of anti-immigrant sentiment in the early 20th century, and as the 21st century progresses, that crack will be the source of a complete collapse.
Everything we know about Carmelita Torres is from a few newspaper accounts in 1917. They called her an auburn-haired Amazon, just 17 years old. She led angry women in anti-American rioting and shut down the U.S.-Mexico border. But hidden within her story is something much bigger than a single riot. It's a story about American paranoia at the border, about a toxic campaign of disinfection and discrimination, and a U.S. practice that would go on to inspire Nazi scientists. At the border between El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, thousands of people cross back and forth for work and school every day. They line up in Juarez and often wait for hours to get through the U.S. checkpoint. But the border didn't always look like this.
Crossing this border used to be free and unrestricted. People would come and go without a passport. But after 1917, Juarez and El Paso became two separate communities.
Need to debloat fast? Here's 6 reasons why you need Seed. Seed is the best antibiotic on the market, period.
It was a turbulent year at the border. The Mexican Revolution was ongoing, and the U.S. was about to enter World War I.
All of a sudden, you have the war hysteria created by World War I. People here in El Paso that are deadly afraid that the Germans are going to attack from Ciudad Juarez.
The fear of invasion brought tensions to the border, while across the U.S., a different movement was gaining strength. The eugenics movement, based on junk science, aimed to create a genetically and morally superior population. That meant stricter controls on immigration, only allowing those deemed fit to enter. On Ellis Island, one of the busiest ports of entry at the time, U.S. health officials were tasked with weeding out immigrants they thought were unfit or disease carriers. And across the country, that process coincided with the stereotyping of Mexicans as inferior and unclean. Dozens of film titles included the word greaser, a derogatory term used to describe Mexicans. This racist sentiment was strong at the U.S.-Mexico border. El Paso's mayor, Tom Lee, had developed an obsession with cleanliness, and it defined his political platform.
This obsession with not only racial purity, but physical purity. He was going to literally clean up El Paso from all these bad elements. And by bad elements, he often meant racially bad elements.
One of Mayor Lee's biggest fears was a disease called typhus, spread by lice. So, under the pretense of sanitary betterment work, he helped lead a campaign to inspect every house in a predominantly Mexican neighborhood. If the inspectors found lice, occupants were forced to take vinegar and kerosene baths, have their heads shaved, and clothing burned. Hundreds of homes were eventually destroyed. Lee also expanded the supposed health measures to include inmates in the El Paso jail.
They had to strip naked, take a bath inside a tub full of kerosene, and on one occasion, it seems somebody lit a match.
27 prisoners, majority Mexican or Mexican American, burned to death in the fire that the newspapers called the jail Holocaust. But despite the tragic fire, Mayor Lee pushed forward with even more aggressive plans.
He sends a telegram, a Western Union telegram, to Rupert Blue, who was the Surgeon General up in Washington, D.C. And basically, well, let me just read it. Hundreds dirty, lousy, destitute Mexicans arriving at El Paso daily will undoubtedly bring and spread typhus unless a quarantine is placed at once.
The government didn't agree to a full quarantine because evidence suggested that typhus wasn't a major threat in the area. But instead, they funded a new disinfection plant at the border in 1916. In this facility, every immigrant considered a second-class citizen had to strip naked. Their clothes were sent to a large steam dryer and then fumigated with toxic pesticides inside the gas room. An inspector would check each person's body, including private parts, for lice. If they found lice, immigrants would have to shave their head and body hair and bathe in a mix of kerosene and vinegar. Some even had their eyelids checked for things like pink eye, and many had to complete puzzles or simple IQ tests to prove that they were fit for entry. After this process, they'd receive a ticket as proof that they were disinfected, but they would need to go through this every 8 days in order to re-enter the US.
So many people didn't speak about it. They didn't talk about this humiliating process, like they kind of internalized it. It's that psychology of shame.
The toxic baths and dehumanizing inspections at the border set the stage for a revolt, led by the 17-year-old maid from Juarez who defied the order to bathe.
Carmelita Torres I've compared her to the Rosa Parks of the border. In the morning of January 28th, 1917, there's this electric trolley full of mostly women that are crossing every day. She convinces the majority, if not all, the women in that trolley to just say no and to refuse. And they start a spontaneous protest.
There are accounts that in addition to the humiliating delousing procedures, for women, there was also sexual humiliation.
There were rumors that, when they entered the plant and then they were told to strip, officers were taking their photos and then posting them in bars. So I can't even imagine the kind of feeling, like the feelings of violation and the feelings of, outrage.
She was called an instigator, a ringleader, but she was just a young woman that was just sick of the injustice, of the humiliation that other women had gone through.
What started with just 200 protesters that morning slowly grew to a crowd of 2,000. Reporters said the scene reminded one of bees swarming. The hands of the feminine mob would claw at the tops of the passing cars. When the American officers tried to disperse the crowd, they were met with bottles, rocks, and insults. Protesters even laid down on the tracks in front of the trolley cars to create a blockade. They were joined by men in what's called the bath riots, and they shut down this border for 2 days.
And then all you hear is that the ringleaders are arrested and a few of the men are publicly executed.
As for Carmelita Torres,
it appears like she was thrown in prison, and as historians, we don't know what happened to her afterwards. We've lost every trace.
Back in 2022, I lost 2 very important people in my life, big figures. It really wasn't until
the fumigations didn't stop after the riots. In 1917 alone, over 100,000 Mexicans were deloused at the border. That same year, an immigration law made border procedures even more rigid. Immigrants at all points of entry needed to have a passport, take a literacy test, and many would have to pay an $8 head tax. And later that year, the U.S. Public Health Service laid down instructions for border agents about who should be kept out of the country.
Imbeciles, idiots, feeble-minded persons, physical defectives, persons afflicted with loathsome or dangerous contagious diseases.
The discriminatory policies at the border resembled horrific events elsewhere in the world. In fact, while researching this, David stumbled upon a detail. The fumigation of Mexican immigrants wasn't just reminiscent of Nazi Germany, it was directly linked to it.
It's not so much that the United States was copying Nazi Germany, it's the opposite. Nazi Germany was copying the United States.
He found that in the 1920s, the US started using Zyklon B, an extremely poisonous acid gas, to fumigate clothing at the border. And in 1937, in a German pest science journal, a scientist called for the use of Zyklon B in Nazi disinfection chambers. He included 2 photos of El Paso's delousing chambers as an example of how effective Zyklon B had been at the US border to kill unwanted pests. The same scientist pushed to use it to disinfect concentration camps, and eventually, it was used in concentrated doses to murder millions of people.
People, rightly so, say you can't compare what happened in Nazi Germany with other parts of the world. And that's true. In terms of Zyklon B, it was used on the border not to intentionally kill Mexican border crossers. But the history of something like the Holocaust
.org, War, Peace, and the Presidency, Breaking with Convention. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We're continuing to look at Donald Trump's running mate, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, who first gained fame after he wrote his memoir, Hillbilly Elegy. We're joined by Nancy Eisenberg. She's an American historian and the author of the award-winning book, White Trash, The 400-Year Untold History of Class in America.
She wrote a widely cited review of Hillbilly Elegy for the New This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, War, Peace, and the Presidency, Breaking with Convention. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We're continuing to look at Donald Trump's running mate, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, who first gained fame after he wrote his memoir, Hillbilly Elegy. We're joined by Nancy Eisenberg. She's an American historian and the author of the award-winning book, White Trash, The 400-Year Untold History of Class in America.
She wrote a widely cited review of Hillbilly Elegy for the New York Review of Books in 2018, headlined Left Behind. She's Professor Emeritus of History at Louisiana State University. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, Nancy Eisenberg. When President Trump named J.D. Vance as the vice presidential nominee, as his pick to be vice president if he wins, can you talk about your response, informed by your response to Hillbilly Elegy?
Yeah, hi. I wasn't completely surprised because I did write a review that I think didn't go along with the general chatting class consensus that Hillbilly Elegy was somehow a revelation or told us the truth about the people who were supporting Trump, I'm more skeptical. I was skeptical from the beginning because memoirs are about self-fashioning. The strongest message in Hillbilly Elegy, which is the one that was echoed last night at the Republican convention, is the self-made man myth. This is the myth that somehow America creates opportunities, and just like Benjamin Franklin, you can fashion yourself and you can rise the ladder to success. And this is very much something that J.D. Vance, I think, believes in. It is a part of his memoir, but much of what his memoir says tells us nothing about real class conditions. I mean, the person you just had on from Politico who talked about the Scotch-Irish tradition, that's a myth. That was a myth that was reinvented in the 1980s by people like Grady Whitney, who were trying to shift the debate to an ethnic identity instead of talking about class. And that is something that Americans have trouble addressing, is class divisions, and the Republicans don't talk about them, and the Democrats don't talk about them. And I think this is kind of the undercurrent of J.D. Vance. And I would say, on top of everything, the reason he was chosen, and what wasn't mentioned so far, yourself and you can rise the ladder to success. And this is very much something that J.D. Vance, I think, believes in. It is a part of his memoir, but much of what his memoir says tells us nothing about real class conditions. I mean, the person you just had on from Politico who talked about the Scotch-Irish tradition, that's a myth. That was a myth that was reinvented in the 1980s by people like Grady Whitney, who were trying to shift the debate to an ethnic identity instead of talking about class. And that is something that Americans have trouble addressing, is class divisions, and the Republicans don't talk about them, and the Democrats don't talk about them. And I think this is kind of the undercurrent of J.D. Vance. And I would say, on top of everything, the reason he was chosen, and what wasn't mentioned so far, is because of his youth. This has been in the news, the media, everyone's been attacking Biden for being too old, and then Trump is too old. So now they pick a 39-year-old young man who projects youthfulness. Why? Because it appeals to the media. That's why he's on the ticket. And that his rise was created by the mainstream media. It was the liberals who embraced him. It was the liberals who were reading Hillbilly Elegy, not Trumpsters.
And so, Professor Nancy Eisenberg, if you could, explain the argument in your book, White Trash, the 400-year untold history of class in America. First of all, explain the origin of this extraordinary phrase, white trash, and then what the myths are about class and poverty that pervade American political and social life, and why you think that's the case.
Well, my book is challenging the big myth about America, which again is the American dream, which is connected to the self-made man, that somehow magically at the time of the revolution, we broke from Great Britain and we eliminated aristocracies, we eliminated class divisions, and somehow we were a unique, free, liberated people. Well, none of that is true. We have, throughout our history, relied heavily on English traditions. Where do you think we got our law, the common law? And not only that, the ideologies of class have been pervasive in America. And I think this is the sad thing that we forget. And the reason that white trash still exists today is because it goes all the way back to the colonial period. It goes back to the Elizabethan period, when the original purpose on the part of the English for colonization was to dump the, quote, waste people. That's where white trash comes from, referring to the expendables, the people who were hurting the economy in Great Britain, dump them into the colonies and get rid of the rubbish. That's the term that Thomas Jefferson used. He referred to raked from the rubbish. So trash literally means trash. And if you can think of any negative connotation associated with waste, that was part of the rhetoric as well. In our class system, what we also don't understand, this was very much a rural notion, because waste not only means rubbish, it means wastelands. And this is a part of the common law, but this is the idea of unfallow, unplowed, unproductive land. And these are the terminologies that provide the foundation for talking about white trash. And our class system, and this term has evolved over time, they referred to as crackers, squatters. They are people who are trespassers, criminals. Crackers comes from crack-brained, which attacks their intellectual abilities. So every negative kind of association that you can attach to a group, that has been applied to people who fall under this rubric. And we also have to distinguish, white trash doesn't include all people who are poor or struggling. There are more refined distinctions. So even to this day, there's a distinction among Americans in more rural areas, and particularly in the South, a distinction between white trash and rednecks. Rednecks are hardworking. Their necks are red because they're burnt from the sun. They were associated with living in the swamps in the South. Hillbilly is a very distinctive term, people from the hills, that in a sense is all linking people to specific regions, specific kinds of land. And this is important when we erase all of this, because we think that Americans are detached from the land. Well, property is still the most important source of wealth. And I think we need to remember that white trash is still with us. We have modern trailer trash. We have these terms that are still thrown around, but just changing the language isn't going to get rid of the class divisions. And that's where I think liberals are really at fault. You can't just rewrite the language, which historians have done. They refer to people moving west as squatters and eliminating the terms that were used at the time, as settlers instead of squatters and crackers. So we have to kind of face the fact that class divisions are real and that there are distinctions. We can't just think of the urban poor as exactly the same as the rural poor.
Damn, man, you guys are quiet. All right, I guess I'll go. Cool. So you guys are probably wondering why I have that page. It's kind of funny, man, because I found somebody forwarded this to me, and I don't know. He looks like Bernard Hopkins. So, it's for the sake of kind of making fun of it in a sense. Like, yo, Bernard! We found your son. No, just kidding. When Paul and the MESHIACHA confound you, I have some brothers or sister that, we still are into that old or new, whatever, right? So there's no knock on you guys. This is actually a video that was sent to me, man, and I want to make sure that I can, I'm going to answer these questions. This isn't about Canaanite stuff today, even though this guy is a Canaanite, I guess. I don't know, but his doctrine is pretty flimsy. So let's begin. Matter of fact, here's what I'm gonna do, because I'm not gonna do a lot of not gonna really play much stuff. I'll play the video, but that's as far as it's gonna be. So let me do this. Put this in the background. Give me a second here real quick.
It's everything you wished for. Your site traffic is skyrocketing.
All right, hold on a second, family. Okay, cool. Sounds good. All right, that's what I like. Oh, there we go. Let's get into this, family. All right, so let's start. Let's begin. Where do we go? Isaiah. No, I lie. Ecclesiastes, chapter 5, and verse 8. Now, you guys obviously know the kind of classes that I've been showing lately. I think I piled enough crap on them. It's gonna take some time to clean it up. So in the meantime, let's start kind of getting rid of these confusing doctrines. And I'm gonna show you that in the New Testament, it even shows how they're going to be like this. They're gonna be, we're gonna see in the Bible, in the scriptures, the law, right? How the Messiah was going to be very clear with us as to how they would be acting. We see it. But let's begin. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 8, it says, if thou seest the oppression of the poor and violent perverting of judgment, meaning like what we see, violent perverting of judgment. Do we not find this in no matter what church you turn to, whether you go to the white Jesus or the black Jesus? One is too loving, the other one's like a beast. And I don't mean it in any negative, I'm just talking about the spirit. One's too effeminate, one's too much. There's no balance, right? So again, if thou seest the oppression of the poor, I can't go left, I can't go right, man. What do I do? And violent perverting of judgment. Oh, one person says, hey, you don't have to keep the laws of God. Another one says, well, you have to believe that the Messiah is black. And violent perverting of judgment. And justice in the... Hold on a second. Let me do this. Hold on. Okay, sorry, family. So, it's been a couple days that I haven't turned on the camera, so let me go ahead and turn it on. All right, as you can see, that's my favorite team. So, yep. I'm a Dolphins fan.